in the shadows of ancient Israel's golden age, when King David ruled from his palace in Jerusalem, a story unfolded that would shake the very foundations of divine justice. It's a tale of corruption in high places, of a prophet who dared to speak truth to power, and of a king whose hunger for another man's wife led him down a path so dark that it would forever stain his legacy. Have you ever wondered what happens when those in authority believe they are above the law? When power corrupts so completely that murder becomes just another tool of statecraft? The story we're about to explore reveals one of the most shocking episodes in biblical history, a story that many know only fragments of, but whose full horror will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about heroes and villains. This isn't just another Sunday school lesson. This is a raw, unfiltered look at human nature at its worst and divine justice at its most severe. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why this single act of betrayal changed the course of an entire kingdom and why the consequences of one man's sin rippled through generations. But before we dive into this dark chapter, let me tell you why this story matters today. In our world of political scandals, abuse of power, and the silencing of whistleblowers, the death of Prophet Uriah serves as a timeless warning about what happens when authority goes unchecked. The parallels to our modern world are so striking that you'll find yourself seeing today's headlines in an entirely new light. I'm about to take you behind the palace walls of ancient Jerusalem, into the private chambers where deadly schemes were hatched, and onto the battlefield where an innocent man met his doom. This story has everything: forbidden love, political intrigue, military deception, and divine retribution. Most importantly, it reveals how one moment of unchecked desire can destroy lives and kingdoms. So settle in, because we're about to uncover one of the Bible's most disturbing tales, and I guarantee you've never heard it told quite like this before. Our story begins during the height of Israel's golden age. King David, the shepherd boy who had slain Goliath and united the 12 tribes, now ruled from his magnificent palace in Jerusalem. The city bustled with prosperity, the temple construction was underway, and Israel's enemies trembled at the mere mention of David's name. Yet beneath this veneer of success, something rotten was beginning to fester in the heart of the king. It was springtime, the season when kings traditionally went out to war. The Ammonites had provoked Israel, and David's army, led by his trusted general Joab, had marched out to lay siege to the city of Rabbah. But for the first time in his reign, David chose to remain in Jerusalem. This decision, seemingly insignificant, would prove to be the first domino in a chain of events that would lead to one of the Bible's most tragic stories. While his soldiers fought and died on distant battlefields, David found himself restless in his palace. One evening, as the sun was setting over the ancient city, he walked out onto his rooftop terrace to enjoy the cool air. From this elevated position, the king could see across the rooftops of his capital, watching his subjects go about their evening routines. It was during one of these casual observations that David's eyes fell upon something that would change everything. There, on a nearby rooftop, a woman was bathing in the privacy of her own home. The Bible tells us simply that she was very beautiful, but these few words carry the weight of destiny. David, instead of turning away as any righteous man should have done, found himself transfixed. He watched, and in that moment of voyeuristic indulgence, the seeds of destruction were planted. But who was this woman? David, consumed with desire, sent servants to inquire about her identity. The answer they brought back should have stopped him in his tracks. Her name was Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, and she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. That last detail is crucial. Uriah was not just any random citizen, but one of David's elite warriors, a member of his inner circle known as the 30. Now, let's pause here and consider the significance of Uriah's identity. He was a Hittite, meaning he was not ethnically Israeli, yet he had risen to become one of David's most trusted soldiers. This speaks to his exceptional character and loyalty. While many of Israel's own sons might have faltered, this foreign-born warrior had proven himself repeatedly in battle, earning his place among the king's elite guard. The irony is devastating. David was about to betray the very man who had shown unwavering loyalty to his throne. But David's desire had become an obsession. Despite knowing that Bathsheba was married, despite knowing that her husband was fighting in his service, despite knowing that what he contemplated was adultery of the highest order, David made his choice. He sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to the palace. What happened next is recorded in Scripture with stark simplicity. She came to him, and he slept with her. But behind these simple words lies a complex web of power dynamics and moral failure. Was Bathsheba a willing participant, or was she powerless to refuse the king's advances? The text doesn't tell us her thoughts or feelings, but we must remember that in ancient times, refusing a king's summons could mean death. The power imbalance was absolute. After this encounter, Bathsheba returned to her home, and David likely thought the matter was closed. He had satisfied his desire, and perhaps he believed life could simply return to normal. But sin has a way of refusing to remain hidden, and several weeks later, a message arrived at the palace that would shatter David's illusions of control. The message was brief but earth-shattering. "I am pregnant." Suddenly, David's moment of passion had become a crisis of epic proportions. In ancient Israel, adultery was punishable by death, and if Bathsheba's condition became known, both she and David would face severe consequences. More than that, David's reputation as the righteous king chosen by God would be destroyed forever. What David did next reveals the true depth of his moral corruption. Instead of confessing his sin and accepting the consequences, he chose to compound his evil with an even greater one. He decided to cover up his adultery by orchestrating the death of Uriah, the very man he had wronged. David's plan was as clever as it was wicked. He sent a message to Joab, his general in the field, commanding him to send Uriah back to Jerusalem under the pretense of wanting a report on the war's progress. When Uriah arrived, David greeted him warmly, asking about Joab's health, the soldiers' welfare, and how the battle was going. After receiving Uriah's report, David dismissed him with what seemed like royal generosity. "Go down to your house and wash your feet." This was more than mere hospitality. David was hoping that Uriah would sleep with his wife, making it impossible to determine the true father of Bathsheba's child. To sweeten the deal, David even sent a gift from the royal table to Uriah's house. But Uriah's response revealed the nobility of character that made David's betrayal all the more heinous. Instead of going home to enjoy the comforts of his house and wife, Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all the king's servants. When David learned of this, he summoned Uriah and asked why he hadn't gone home. Uriah's answer stands as one of the most powerful testimonies to honor and loyalty in all of Scripture. "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Here was a man so committed to his duty, so loyal to his fellow soldiers, that he refused to enjoy pleasures denied to them. While they slept on the hard ground of a battlefield, he would not allow himself the luxury of a soft bed and his wife's embrace. The contrast between Uriah's nobility and David's depravity could not have been starker. David, growing desperate, tried once more. He invited Uriah to dine with him and deliberately got him drunk, thinking that wine might lower his moral defenses. But even intoxicated, Uriah maintained his principles and again slept with the servants rather than going home to his wife. At this point, David realized that Uriah's honor was unshakable. No amount of hospitality or manipulation would cause this righteous man to abandon his principles. And it was precisely this righteousness that sealed Uriah's fate. for David now knew there was only one way to solve his problem. The next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, but this was no ordinary military correspondence, it was a death warrant. The contents of this letter reveal the depths to which David had sunk. Put Uriah out in front, where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die. The cruel irony of this command cannot be overstated. David was ordering Uriah's own commander to arrange his murder, and he was doing so by exploiting Uriah's very loyalty and courage. He knew that Uriah would never shrink from the fiercest fighting. His honor would compel him to be where the danger was greatest. But perhaps the most chilling detail of all is what happened next. David sealed the letter and handed it to Uriah himself to carry to Joab. Picture this scene: the righteous soldier, still believing in his king's honor, faithfully carrying his own death sentence back to the battlefield. Uriah became the unwitting messenger of his own doom, his loyalty and obedience used as weapons against him. As Uriah rode away from Jerusalem, carrying David's letter, he had no idea that he would never see his wife again, never return to his home, never discover that he was about to become the victim of the very man he served so faithfully. The tragic irony is overwhelming here. Was a man whose only crime was being married to a beautiful woman and serving his king with unwavering loyalty. The stage was now set for one of the most calculated murders in biblical history. David had crossed a line from which there would be no return, and Uriah, the innocent victim, was riding toward his death, still believing in the righteousness of his cause and the honor of his king. But this story is far from over. What happened next would expose the true cost of David's sins and reveal that no one, not even a king chosen by God himself, is above divine justice. The consequences of these actions would reverberate through generations, proving that some betrayals are so profound they reshape the very foundations of kingdoms. When Joab received David's letter, he must have read its contents with growing horror. Here was his king, the man anointed by God, ordering him to commit murder through military deception. Yet Joab, himself, no stranger to the darker arts of warfare and politics, understood the implications immediately. He was being made complicit in a crime that would stain them all. The siege of Rabbah provided the perfect cover for David's murderous scheme. The Ammonite city was well fortified, and there were indeed places where the fighting was fiercest, where brave men went to die in service to their king. Joab began to formulate a plan that would fulfill David's deadly request while maintaining the appearance of legitimate military action. But as Joab prepared to execute this order, we must pause to consider the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just murder, it was the ultimate betrayal of the military code that bound these men together. Soldiers trust their commanders with their lives, believing that their leaders will use their sacrifice wisely and honorably. David was perverting this sacred trust, turning it into an instrument of personal convenience. The plan Joab devised was brutally simple yet militarily sound enough to avoid suspicion. He would launch an assault on the strongest part of Rabbah's defenses, positioning Uriah at the point of greatest danger. Then, at the crucial moment, he would withdraw support, leaving Uriah and a few other soldiers exposed to the enemy's concentrated fire. To any observer, it would appear to be either a tactical miscalculation or the fortunes of war claiming another brave warrior. As the day of the assault arrived, Uriah prepared himself as he had countless times before. He checked his weapons, adjusted his armor, and likely offered prayers to the God of Israel for victory and protection. The tragic irony is that he was praying to the same God whose anointed king had already condemned him to death. The attack began at dawn. Joab positioned his forces according to his deadly plan, placing Uriah and several other warriors at the front lines, where the enemy resistance would be strongest. These men, unaware they were being sacrificed, fought with the courage and skill that had made them legendary throughout Israel. As the battle intensified, Uriah distinguished himself once again. Contemporary accounts from similar sieges tell us that such assaults were chaotic, brutal affairs where men fought hand to hand in narrow spaces where a moment's hesitation meant death. Yet Uriah, true to his character, fought not just for his own survival but to protect his fellow soldiers and achieve victory for Israel. But then came the moment David and Joab had orchestrated. At the height of the fighting, when Uriah and his men were most deeply engaged with the enemy, Joab gave the signal for the supporting troops to withdraw. Suddenly, the small group of warriors found themselves cut off, surrounded by enemy forces with no hope of reinforcement or retreat. The men under Uriah's command must have looked to him in that desperate moment, expecting their leader to find a way out of this impossible situation. But what could Uriah do? His military training, his sense of duty, his love for his fellow soldiers, all of these noble qualities now became the instruments of his destruction. Rather than abandon his men or attempt to save himself, Uriah chose to fight to the end. He rallied his soldiers, encouraging them even as arrows and spears found their marks. One by one, these brave men fell, victims not of enemy strategy or superior force, but of their own king's betrayal. When Uriah finally fell, struck down by Ammonite weapons but killed by David's treachery, he died believing he was giving his life for Israel. His final thoughts were likely of his duty, his brothers in arms, perhaps even of his king back in Jerusalem, who he believed honored his sacrifice. He never knew that his death was not a noble sacrifice for his nation, but a murder orchestrated by the very man he served. The other soldiers who died alongside Uriah were equally innocent victims of David's crime. Their names are lost to history, but their deaths weigh just as heavily on the scales of divine justice. These men had families, dreams, futures that were cut short not by the fortunes of war, but by one man's lust and another man's willingness to enable murder. When the battle was over and the dead were counted, Joab faced the grim task of reporting back to David. He had to craft a message that would convey the success of their murderous mission while maintaining the appearance of a routine military casualty report. The cynicism required for such a task reveals how deeply David's corruption had spread, infecting even his most trusted commanders. Joab's message to David was a masterpiece of military deception. He reported that during an assault on the city, some of Israel's finest warriors had fallen, including Uriah the Hittite. The report was structured to sound like a tactical error. They had pressed too close to the city walls and been caught in a deadly crossfire from the defenders above. But Joab included a subtle signal in his message, a reference that would let David know the true purpose had been accomplished. He anticipated that David might initially respond with anger at the apparent tactical blunder, so he instructed his messenger to conclude with the key information. Also, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. When David received this news, his response revealed the complete moral transformation of a man who had once been described as having a heart after God's own. Instead of grief for a fallen hero, instead of anger at the loss of one of his best warriors, David felt only relief. The obstacle to his cover-up had been removed. David's words to the messenger were chilling in their casual dismissal of a good man's death. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. These words, spoken about the death of a man who had served him faithfully, reveal how completely David's conscience had been seared by his sin. But David wasn't content to simply dismiss Uriah's death as a casualty of war. He now moved to complete his scheme by making Bathsheba his wife. After the customary period of mourning, a mere formality that mocked the genuine grief, Bathsheba may have felt David sent for her and married her. To the outside world, this must have appeared as a generous gesture from their king. Here was David, showing kindness to the widow of a fallen hero, providing her with security and status by making her one of his wives. The people of Jerusalem likely praised their king's compassion. never suspecting the truth behind this apparent act of charity. Bathsheba gave birth to David's son, and it seemed that the king's elaborate cover-up had succeeded completely. The child's parentage appeared legitimate. Uriah's inconvenient loyalty had been permanently silenced, and David's reputation remained intact. From a purely worldly perspective, David had solved his problem with ruthless efficiency. But there was one observer of these events who could not be deceived by appearances or fooled by carefully crafted lies. The scriptures tell us with stark simplicity, "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." These 8 words carry more weight than all of David's schemes and machinations. The God who sees all things, who knows every secret thought and hidden motive, was not impressed by David's political maneuvering. The divine displeasure mentioned in Scripture was not merely disapproval, it was the righteous anger of a holy God who had seen his anointed king commit adultery, orchestrate murder, and then compound these sins with deception and self-justification. David may have fooled his subjects and even his closest advisors, but he could not hide his crimes from the one who had placed him on the throne. What David failed to understand in his moment of apparent triumph was that divine justice operates on a different timeline than human schemes. God's response to sin is not always immediate, but it is always certain. The consequences of David's actions were already set in motion, gathering like storm clouds on the horizon of his reign. The death of Uriah had solved David's immediate problem, but it had created a far greater crisis, a crisis that would shake the very foundations of his kingdom and reveal that no one, regardless of their position or past righteousness, is beyond the reach of divine judgment. As David settled into what he believed was his successful deception, as he looked upon his new wife and their child, as he continued to rule from his palace in Jerusalem, he had no idea that his crimes had already been recorded in the courts of heaven. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, it would prove that the murder of one righteous man could topple kingdoms, and that the God of Israel would not be mocked, even by his chosen king. The stage was now set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in biblical history, a confrontation that would strip away David's pretenses and expose the true cost of his sins before the entire nation. The prophet Nathan was already preparing to deliver a message that would shatter David's world and prove that divine justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied. The months that followed Uriah's death were a testament to how thoroughly sin can blind even the most gifted leaders. David ruled with the same authority, made the same pronouncements, and received the same reverence from his subjects. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. The man who had once danced before the ark with pure joy, who had written psalms of intimate communion with God, now carried the weight of blood on his hands. Bathsheba, now installed as one of David's wives, lived in the palace with their son. But what must those private moments have been like? Did she ever look at her husband and see the man who had orchestrated her first husband's death? Did David ever catch her gaze and wonder what thoughts lay behind her eyes? The scriptures are silent on these intimate details, but the psychological weight of their shared secret must have been crushing. Meanwhile, in the army camps and throughout Israel, Uriah was remembered as a hero. Stories were told of his final battle, of how he had fought courageously to the end. Veterans who had served alongside him spoke of his unwavering loyalty and his refusal to enjoy privileges denied to his fellow soldiers. His name became synonymous with honor and sacrifice, which made David's knowledge of the truth all the more unbearable. But the most chilling aspect of this period was how easily David seemed to compartmentalize his guilt. He continued to function as king, making decisions about justice and righteousness while harboring the darkest of secrets. He sat in judgment over others' crimes, while his own far greater crime remained hidden. This ability to maintain a double life reveals something terrifying about human nature, how we can become architects of our own moral blindness. The child born to David and Bathsheba grew and thrived, a constant reminder of the sin that had brought him into existence. Yet David likely looked upon this boy with genuine affection, perhaps even convincing himself that some good had come from his actions. This capacity for self-deception is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of unchecked power, the ability to reframe even our greatest failures as justified necessities. During this time, David's other wives and children continued their palace lives, unaware that their husband and father had become a murderer. His advisors brought him reports from across the kingdom, trusting in his wisdom and righteousness. The priests offered sacrifices on his behalf, believing they were interceding for a man after God's own heart. The tragic irony was complete. An entire nation was being led by someone living a lie so profound it touched every aspect of governance and worship. The war with the Ammonites continued, and Joab sent regular reports from the field. Each message was a reminder of their shared secret, though they were carefully worded to appear routine. The other soldiers fought bravely, perhaps inspired by stories of Uriah's heroic last stand, never knowing they were being led by men who had orchestrated their comrade's death. In the broader kingdom, life went on as normal. Farmers tended their fields, merchants conducted their trade, and families raised their children in the prosperity that David's earlier righteous reign had established. They trusted in their king's integrity, believing that God's blessing continued to rest upon their nation through his leadership. This trust made David's deception all the more devastating. An entire people were unknowingly complicit in honoring a man who had committed the gravest of sins. But God's silence during this period was not indifference, it was preparation. In the heavenly courts, the case against David was being prepared with meticulous care. Every detail of his crime was known, every moment of self-justification recorded. The divine prosecutor was gathering evidence not just of David's actions, but of their far-reaching consequences. The widow's tears, the orphaned child's future, the corruption of military honor, the betrayal of sacred trust, all of it was being weighed in the scales of perfect justice. During these months, David may have begun to believe he had escaped consequences entirely. The immediate crisis had passed, his secret remained safe, and life had returned to what seemed like normal. This false sense of security is perhaps the cruelest aspect of delayed judgment. It allows the guilty to compound their original sin with pride and self-satisfaction. Yet there were signs, if David had been willing to see them, that his actions had set forces in motion beyond his control. The kingdom that had once known unparalleled unity began to show subtle cracks. His own family dynamics grew more complex and troubled. The very prosperity that his earlier righteousness had established began to carry within it the seeds of future discord. The psychological toll of maintaining such a massive deception must have been enormous. David had to remember which version of events he had told to whom, had to maintain consistent reactions to mentions of Uriah's name, had to project grief and respect for a man whose death he had orchestrated. Every public appearance became a performance, every conversation a potential trap. Most tragically, David's relationship with God, once the defining characteristic of his life, had been fundamentally altered. The man who had written, "Create in me a clean heart, O God," now carried the stain of premeditated murder on his soul. His prayers, if he still offered them, must have felt hollow. His worship, if he still engaged in it, must have seemed like mockery. The palace servants and officials who worked closest to David may have sensed changes in their king, though they likely attributed any differences to the stresses of leadership or the natural aging process. None would have suspected that their righteous king had become capable of cold-blooded murder. This trust in David's character provided him with perfect cover, while simultaneously making his betrayal all the more heinous. As the seasons changed and the child grew, David's crime seemed increasingly like ancient history. The immediate players in the drama had moved on. Joab remained focused on military campaigns, Bathsheba adapted to palace life, and the soldiers who had witnessed Uriah's death were scattered across various assignments. The conspiracy of silence seemed unbreakable, but the most dangerous aspect of David's situation was not the external threats to his secret, it was the internal transformation that was taking place. Each day that passed without consequence made the next deception easier, the next moral compromise more justifiable. David was not just hiding from justice, he was actively moving further away from the man God had called him to be. The kingdom's priests continued to offer sacrifices for their king's success and righteousness, unknowingly asking God to bless a murderer. The people continued to sing songs about David's victories and God's favor upon their nation, creating a soundtrack of innocence that played over the reality of their leader's guilt. The contrast between appearance and reality had become so complete that it seemed nothing could shatter the illusion. Yet in the divine economy, no sin remains hidden forever, and no injustice goes unaddressed. The very success of David's cover-up was setting the stage for a revelation that would be all the more shocking for its delay. The longer the deception continued, the more dramatic its exposure would be. Unknown to David, God was already preparing the instrument of his judgment, a prophet named Nathan, who had served as David's spiritual advisor and friend. Nathan had been present for many of David's greatest triumphs, had delivered God's promises to the king, and had witnessed the intimate relationship between David and his Creator. This made Nathan the perfect choice for what was to come, because his words would carry the weight not just of prophetic authority, but of personal betrayal and disappointment. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would strip away every pretense and reveal the true cost of David's choices. The man who had thought himself clever enough to outwit divine justice was about to discover that God's patience should never be mistaken for God's blindness. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, it would prove that the death of one righteous man had consequences that reached far beyond the grave, consequences that would shake kingdoms, destroy families, and demonstrate once and for all that no one, not even God's chosen king, could escape the demands of perfect justice. The day of reckoning arrived without fanfare, as divine justice often does. It came not with thunder and lightning, but in the form of a trusted friend walking through the palace gates. Nathan the prophet had served David faithfully for years, delivering God's messages of blessing and guidance. He had been present for David's greatest triumphs, had witnessed the king's intimate conversations with the Almighty, and had seen firsthand the transformation of a shepherd boy into Israel's greatest ruler. But the man approaching David's throne room that day carried a burden heavier than any message he had ever delivered. The weight of divine revelation pressed upon Nathan's shoulders as he prepared to confront the king who had once been called a man after God's own heart. What Nathan was about to do required incredible courage. He was going to accuse the most powerful man in Israel of murder. As Nathan entered the royal chamber, David likely greeted him warmly. After all, Nathan had been his spiritual confidant, the voice of God in his life during the most crucial decisions of his reign. The king probably expected another message of blessing or perhaps guidance about some matter of state. Instead, Nathan was about to deliver the most devastating prophecy in Israel's history. But Nathan was far too wise to make a direct accusation immediately. He understood human psychology and the defensive mechanisms that kick in when powerful people are confronted with their crimes. Instead, he chose to tell David a story, a parable that would lead the king to condemn himself with his own words. "There were two men in a certain city," Nathan began, his voice steady but his heart surely pounding. "One was rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb which he had bought and nourished. It grew up together with him and with his children. It ate of his own food and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him." David listened intently, perhaps nodding along as he pictured this touching scene. The imagery was powerful, a poor man's single lamb, cherished like a family member, sharing his meager food and even sleeping in his arms. It was a picture of pure, simple love, and the kind of bond that forms between those who have little but share everything. Nathan continued, his voice growing more intense. And a traveler came to the rich man, who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd, to prepare one for the wayfaring man who had come to him. Instead, he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. The silence that followed was electric. David's face flushed with righteous anger as the injustice of the story hit him. Here was exactly the kind of abuse of power that he, as king, was supposed to prevent. The wealthy man had countless animals of his own, yet he had stolen the one precious possession of a poor man who had nothing else. It was an act of pure cruelty, made worse by the fact that the rich man had the means to show hospitality without causing any hardship to himself. David's response came swift and fierce, revealing that his sense of justice had not been completely corrupted by his own crimes. "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die, and he shall restore fourfold for the lamb, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." The irony was devastating. David, the murderer, was calling for the death penalty. David, the adulterer, was demanding justice. David, who had shown no pity to Uriah, was condemning another man for lacking compassion. In his anger at the fictional rich man's cruelty, David was revealing that he still knew right from wrong, which made his own crimes all the more inexcusable. Nathan let David's words hang in the air for a moment, allowing the weight of the king's own judgment to settle. Then, with the authority of divine revelation backing every syllable, Nathan delivered the words that would shatter David's world. "You are the man." The truth that Nathan revealed that day echoes through history as a reminder that no earthly power can escape divine justice. David's elaborate schemes, his careful deceptions, his abuse of royal authority, all of it crumbled in the face of 4 simple words. "You are the man." The death of Uriah the Hittite wasn't just the murder of one righteous soldier. It was the moment when unchecked power revealed its true face, when a king, chosen by God himself, proved that even the mightiest can fall to the depths of moral corruption. Today, as we witness similar abuses of authority in our own world, Uriah's story serves as both warning and hope, warning that power without accountability destroys everything it touches, but hope that truth will always find a way to break through the darkness, no matter how carefully we try to hide it.